Well, here we are doing this again. Welcome, guys, to the next What I Watched segment. This, of course, is for October. Again, as always, I know this is late. I'm really trying to catch up. I know I say that very often, but I really am trying to catch up, and I hope doing this and hopefully getting done at least the movies in November, hopefully that'll show you guys that I'm serious about actually trying to catch up here. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. October was a very busy month. There was a lot of movies that came out. That's probably why it's taken me so long to get to this point, because there were a lot of movies in October, and same with November as well, that I wanted to review individually. So there weren't as many that I wanted to put in this segment. There were a lot more that I wanted to review individually, so that's why it's taken me so long. But there still are a good amount of films to talk about here. There's some I didn't even get round to that you won't see in until the end of the year catch-up review, which is still gonna happen because there's a lot that I still haven't seen. But we're just gonna go ahead and get started here. So the first one we're going to be talking about is one that you probably expect me to do an individual review for, and that's Venom, There Be Carnage. And look, you guys know I really hated the first Venom a lot. I get why some people really do enjoy it, because it has that sort of feel of early 2000s superhero movies and things like that, but just the constant identity crisis that film has and the low budget feel of it all, it just never really worked for me. The whole movie kind of felt like a rights retaining sort of film that Sony was doing in an effort to make sure that Marvel didn't take the rights away from them. And now we get to Let There Be Carnage, and I will say this film is definitely better. It's definitely better than the first movie. I don't hate this movie by any means, but I still don't like it that much either. The one thing I will absolutely give it is that, unlike the first movie, they have at least figured out what they want these movies to be. They have picked a lane, they've stuck in it. It's much more of a goofy sort of physical comedy, and that's fine. I know a lot of people seem to be enjoying that. The problem is, I just don't think it really works for me. There are some moments here that are fun. The interplay between Venom and Eddie Brock was easily the best part of the first movie, but here I feel like they really overdo it. It feels like they listened to criticisms of the first movie, but they only listened to what people liked. They didn't really listen to what people dislike. So they listened to what people liked, and now they really try to hone in on that, and it just gets to a point where it just gets tiring after a while. The constant back and forth between these two, again, it just gets really tiring, especially with the relationship with Venom and Eddie. They really try to lean into that more here, and it's fun for a little bit, but after a while it's can we please move on to something else? Some of the comedy I think actually works very well. There's a really good fight scene between Eddie and Venom early on that I thought was kind of funny, and then you have stuff like Venom going in a club and him dancing and shit, and it just, I don't know what they're doing. Again, a lot of it feels like they're playing a bit too hard into the comedy here, where I feel like maybe there needs to be a bit more of a balance, and I feel like the first film didn't know what it wanted to be. This one knows what it wants to be, but I think goes a little too hard into it, whereas I think if there was more of a balance, I think that it would be that much better overall, but I just don't think these films have fully found that yet. The thing that really does work for me with this movie is actually Woody Harrelson. I liked him a lot here. Thankfully, they have ditched that horrible wig, which, my God, I'm so happy that they did that. And I think Woody Harrelson as an actor, he just really is having so much fun with this. It seems like he really was just along for the ride. He wasn't trying to take this character too seriously, and as a result, I think it really does work. This is a much more entertaining villain than what we had in the first movie. I think overall he does do a pretty solid job here. I enjoyed his performance a lot. I think he elevates pretty much every scene that he's in. He was definitely a big standout for me. Tom Hardy's also still really good here. He still does a good job of playing the Eddie Brock character, although I will admit, I don't really feel like Eddie Brock as a character has evolved all that much since the first movie. I didn't really feel like there was a clear arc here. It feels like he's still kind of in the same place that he was in the first movie, and so, I don't know, I wasn't again, it's not like I've had a fondness for the Eddie Brock character in the first movie, but I just think Hardy's performance was a little bit stronger in that one because he had more to do, whereas here it's much more of just him being all goofy and shit, and I think he does a good job with that, but there isn't a lot more to him than that. As far as all the other performances go, I mean, Michelle Williams is even more wasted here. The first movie, she really didn't have much to do. Here, she's like barely in it. Like, they try to do this thing with her in the beginning of the movie, and you think maybe she's going to have a bit more relevance, but she really does not come into play in this film until the third act of this movie when they realize, oh yeah, we need to do something with her. Her and Reed Scott, they just randomly come in at the third act of the film, and I enjoyed Reed Scott. I thought he was, like, fun. I didn't really like him in the first one. I liked him a little bit more here. He seems to be having a little bit more fun in this movie, but overall, I mean, they just have no idea what to do with either of those characters, and it's pretty clear to me they just don't really care all that much for them. Stephen Graham as well is utterly wasted. He's this detective in the film that is trying to use Eddie Brock to, like, figure out, more about Cletus Cassidy, and really has no purpose here at all. Like, what he really amounts to, I just found his character to be kind of pointless, and I just wasn't a big fan of him, so I don't think that he worked very well here. So, again, there's a lot that I'm not really liking. Naomi Harris as well, I didn't dislike her in the movie. I think she's a good actress, but I just felt overall her performance was just a little too silly for my liking with what they ended up doing with her. And this is really where we get to my main issue with this film, is that I think by going in this more sillier direction, it actually undercuts a lot of the narrative here. The relation between Cletus Cassidy and Shriek, it very much seems like they're trying to go for like a Joker Harley Quinn type relationship, and I just didn't buy it. I did not buy that that's what that's how this is supposed to be portrayed. I felt like there was a more serious story going on here, and they just didn't really get into it all that much. I feel like these two, they could have done more with that relationship, and I just didn't really feel like they did at the end of the day. They make a big deal out of it in like the first act of this movie, in like the first like 15 to 20 minutes, which was actually really good. I was like, oh my god, I might actually really enjoy this movie. But once Cletus Cassidy, like, breaks out of prison, it really just feels like Shriek is just there because she needs to be. You don't really buy into their relationship. They don't really sell it that well. I just didn't really feel the chemistry all that much. Again, I love Naomi Harris as an actress, but I just felt like she needed more to do here, and I just don't think they did that great of a job with her overall. So again, I think that the screenplay, it's definitely better here in terms of tone. I think a lot of that's due to Andy Serkis. You can tell that he came in and he said, okay, I'm gonna at least give this movie a consistent tone, and he definitely does give it a little bit more of a style. Like, the film feels like it has a bigger budget. The action sequences especially are a lot more memorable this time around. The final battle between, like, Venom and Carnage is actually really good. I was surprised by how into it I was getting. But still, I don't think the film quite worked as well as it really needed to. I think that did bring it down quite a bit. I think that some of the comedy works very well here, but a lot of it did fall flat for me. It's a very hit-or-miss movie, I think, in terms of comedy. I enjoyed quite a few of the performances, but to be honest, there isn't a lot that's that memorable about this movie until you get to the mid-credit scene, which everyone was, like, geeking out over, which, fuck you, Twitter, first of all, for spoiling that for me, like, months in advance. I was really pissed off when that happened because nobody had seen the movie at that point, and people were literally on Twitter like what I thought was a joke, and it turned out to not be a joke, and I was like, what the hell? The mid-credit scene is really good. The mid-credit scene, it definitely gives you the epicness that you want. It is really the only time I felt legitimately shocked and, like, intrigued by something that was happening, and I do think that that mid-credit scene is really great. But that's not the movie. That's just a scene. And I don't think we should tell people to go to a movie just for a mid-credit scene. And I'm not saying that, like, you shouldn't see this movie at all, because I do think there are a lot of redeeming qualities to it, way more than the first movie. It's just, for me, I just don't think this particular franchise is really something I'm enjoying at this point. I get what they're trying to do. I get that they want to go in this more ridiculous direction with this character, but I'm just not really a fan of the way they're portraying Venom in these movies. I don't like this more sort of vigilante type character that he's playing. I don't like that Eddie Brock is so wooden and really doesn't have much character development at all here. He really doesn't change much as a character. There isn't really an arc that he goes through here. I enjoyed Woody Harrelson, although I did feel that Carnage as a villain was kind of wasted here. They didn't dive quite as deep into some aspects of him as I really wanted them to. But overall, it's definitely a better film. I do think there are quite a few things it does right, so I can overall give Venom Let There Be Carnage a C. I wanted to enjoy it a lot more, but just the fact that this movie wasn't absolute garbage, I do think alone is definitely a win, I think, for this film, because considering how bad that first one was, I was expecting nothing but just pure trash from this one, and the fact that it was even slightly okay, I do think is definitely an improvement. So I would definitely say check it out at least. I don't think it's for everyone. I seem to be in a minority though. Most of my friends really seem to have enjoyed it. I just don't think it quite clicked for me in the way that I wanted to, but I didn't hate it. I do want to reiterate that. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either. So yeah, very much in the middle with this one. Oh my god, the Addams Family too. I mean, talk about an unnecessary sequel. Look, Venom Let There Be Carnage, I just talked about how that's a sequel that I wasn't expecting, but at least, like, I wouldn't say it's completely unnecessary. It's trying to establish, like, you know, a separate universe and things like that, so at least has a purpose there. Addams Family 2 has little to no reason to exist, and, like, every single, like, sequel trope that you can think of, this movie plays into, whether it's going on a family vacation or trying to dive deeper into secondary characters but sort of contradicting what made them great in the first place, or trying to introduce like this major plot point that you know isn't going to go anywhere interesting because we have to stick to a status quo, but the film tries to go there anyway. Addams Family 2 falls into literally every single one of those trappings, and like I knew this movie was gonna be really fucking dumb. Like the second this movie started off and we have Wednesday conducting this science experiment with Uncle Fester where he needs to swallow like a fucking Rubik's Cube, and he ends up like burping it out. Like I'm like, this is probably not going to be very good. But where the film ends up going, oh my god, I was so shocked by how terrible this really did become. This is really one of those movies that gets worse and worse as it goes along. And you would think that I would actually enjoy this movie, especially because Wednesday is basically the main character of this film. And you guys know from the first movie, you know, which I really didn't like at all. Like, I borderline hated that film. I didn't hate it, but I came very close to hating it. The thing I liked the most about it was Wednesday. I thought she was the most consistent character. I thought Chloe Grace Moretz was good. She's still really good here as the character. But the problem is Wednesday as a character, because they're focusing on her too much, it just doesn't really feel like they know what to do with her at this point. The entire movie, she's sort of like brooding about how, oh, my family doesn't understand me, and you know exactly what the message is going to be with her. And it just gets very repetitive after that. They don't really know what to do with Wednesday other than she's like the oddball of the family. They don't know how to dive deeper into this character, and that's what really frustrated me about this film, because you have a character that I actually really do like, but they don't know what the hell to do with her anymore. I would say the only scene in this movie where I actually felt like they made an attempt to dive a bit deeper into that side of Wednesday is an actually surprisingly effective scene between her and Cousin It, where they sort of exchange how just how weird they are and how this sort of like brings them together. It was actually a pretty effective scene, but when you have that, but then you also have this recurring joke with Uncle Fester where he's becoming this like fucking like octopus of sorts, and I felt like I was watching like the movie Tusk. You know that movie Tusk that Kevin Smith did? That's like terrible, that like he made because it's supposed to be terrible? Yeah, there's like a whole subplot in this movie that I felt like literally was coming from the movie Tusk. There is a joke in here involving Amazon Prime as well, and like, I was cringing so hard during that joke, but I was cringing even more during the scene where Wednesday and Lurch, they go to this bar to like create this diversion of sorts, and Lurch does something in there that was unspeakable to me. I was like, what the fuck is happening right now? Why are we going in this direction? Why did they think this was a funny idea? It's so stupid. It's so stupid. And I wish I could talk to you guys about it, but it's a spoiler, so I can't say too much. But my God, I couldn't believe some of the things that happened in this movie. I will say the one thing I will give this film is that they do make a bit more of an attempt to dive more into the family aspect, whereas I felt like the first film, it very much felt like it could be centered around any family, and it just happened to be around the Addams Family. This definitely feels more like an Addams Family film, and I did appreciate that. There's more for Gomez to do, there's more for Morticia to do, but again, the problem is, this plot, it just can't sustain a 90-minute runtime before going completely off the rails. There's this really weird subplot with Pugsley where, like, he falls in love with this girl, and, he's struggling to, like, find love, and you know exactly where that's gonna end up going, and where they end up going with that I thought was just really fucking strange. There's this whole subplot with Grandmama Addams where she's trying, because they're on vacation, she has to basically, like, tend to the house, and she ends up catering to, like, fucking like Gen Zers and throwing like this whole party for them, and it was so weird. I was like, why is this in the movie? Why are we trying to do this? I mean, the film, again, it's trying to be so cool and like appeal to younger generations, and it just doesn't work at all. There wasn't a single time in this movie I found myself laughing. I didn't think a single joke ended up working in this film. And then you get to Bill Hader's character, who is the most obvious villain, I think, in, like, any animated film I've seen in a while. Like, you know every single direction he's going in. The second he comes on screen, you know that he's shady. I don't think the fact that he's a villain is even really that much of a shock, because it's obvious to me that he's a villain. Literally everything about his character I thought was completely disposable, and honestly, like, I thought at first he was gonna be a better villain than Allison Janney because he's in the movie more than Allison Janney in the first movie, and he has a little bit more to him than her, but I feel like he was even more obvious than Allison Janney, where, like, at least Allison Janney, from the beginning, they established that she's a villain. Bill Hader, like, it takes a long time for them to establish that, and even though it was, like, completely obvious to me. So, yeah, I mean, just everything about this film pretty much sucks. The animation is a little bit better this time around. It's a little bit more colorful. It's a little less ugly to look at, but my God, I mean, the places that this film goes, I was just so utterly baffled by. I don't know why they thought this was a good idea. I don't know why they continue to do the things that they do with these characters. I just feel like everything about this property is being completely mishandled, and they don't seem to really give a shit at all. Again, this was just a complete disaster overall. I really hated this movie a lot. There's a lot of things that really brought this film down for me. The third act of this film especially, it just goes into complete lunacy. Like, they really don't give any fucks in terms of logic. They don't care if anything makes sense. They just go full on in terms of the ridiculousness, and for some that's really going to work, but for me, I was so checked out at that point that I was just, anything that happened, I was just so annoyed by, and that was a perfect example of one of those things. Really everything about this film to me, I don't know why this came to theaters. Like, this very much had the feel of like a Netflix movie, that, like, you know, of like a sequel that like goes on to Netflix, like sort of like the new Hotel Transylvania movie, how that's going to Amazon Prime. This very much feels like this could have easily gone to Netflix. Like, this could have gone somewhere else that's not in theaters. Like, it's easy to see why this is both a theatrical movie and a VOD film, because I mean, there really isn't much of this at all. This is about as disposable as it gets, I feel like, in terms of animated sequels. Nobody really saw it, which is good, because I don't think that we're going to be getting a third Addams Family movie, but who knows? I didn't think we'd be getting a second Addams Family movie, so who knows? Maybe I'll be sitting here in like a couple years talking about Addams Family 3. I certainly hope not, because these films are just getting worse. They're not getting better, but who knows? You know, why not get an Addams Family 3? I don't know. Not many people saw this movie. I, for some reason, went out of my way to see this film. I was in a theater with actually not that many kids. It was mainly like there were a couple kids in there, but it was mainly like a bunch of like grown adults and like one kid, and you could just see how miserable people were watching this movie. So yeah, I don't really think I'd recommend this one very much at all. D+ for Addams Family 2. I expected this to be a very disposable sequel, but wow, this honestly was even worse than I could have expected it to be. Oh my god, we're talking about another Welcome to the Blumhouse film. Remember how they were doing 8 of these and like they announced that they were coming out in like January and they never appeared? I actually forgot. Like I literally thought I forgot there was supposed to be like 4 more initially, and they just for some reason didn't come out till now. So I thought this was like a whole new batch, but no, this is like the second helping. I don't know if this is gonna be like a yearly thing, but this first one, honestly, I think is a much more promising start than what we had at this point. For one thing, the great thing about this batch of the Welcome Blumhouse films, very much horror films this time around. Like the other ones was kind of like you could consider this horror, but it's not like fully horror. No, this time they have fully leaned into it, and I think they are much better as a result. The majority of these I actually mostly enjoyed. Black as Night is easily the best one, this first one I'm talking about. I think what works so well about this movie is that not only does it work as an actual horror film, but also it has a really strong story to it, and I think that's what works really well, is that you focus on, you know, this girl who already she has a lot of like self-esteem issues and things like that, and she's sort of dealing with, you know, her mom's death that happened earlier, and you sort of see how like she's kind of like blaming herself for that, but she's also very much like squarely in the middle of this war going on between, you know, these vampires that have been going after like people in New Orleans that are like completely disenfranchised, and the way that she gets herself involved with that I thought was actually really interesting. The way they sort of dive deeper into that. There's actually a lot of good social commentary in here about like gentrification and all that stuff, and you know, a little bit of racism and all that stuff. I thought that was very well done, and it wasn't done in a way where it felt like showy, like they were trying to like force these themes on you. Like it felt just natural, like a very natural sort of way to tie in these themes, and I thought they did a good job with that. The movie also is like generally very creepy in quite a few aspects, especially early on when you don't really know what's going on here. They do a really great job with that, so I was overall impressed by that aspect of the film. But I also really enjoyed a lot of these actors. I think Aja Cooper, I've never seen her before, but after this I really hope I do again. She's in another movie that I'm going to be talking about in like a little bit. But she is legitimately, I think, a star. I really want to see her in more movies after this, because I think she definitely does have it in her. She carries this movie very nicely. You're very compelled by her, you know, and I think overall she just does a really great job. I also really enjoyed Fabrizio Guido, who plays her friend Pedro. He is definitely a big standout in pretty much every scene that he's in. I thought he was definitely a very fun character to follow. So I really enjoyed what they ended up doing with him as a character. Even the guy that she's pursuing in this film, you know, I didn't find him to be just like some generic guy. Like I actually was somewhat attached to him. They do a good job, I think, of building that relationship, and that's something that I overall did enjoy, so I thought that worked out pretty well. I think my only issues with this movie is that I think once we start to lean heavier into what's going on, it just starts to feel a little bit rushed overall. I would have liked to focus more on, you know, how this all sort of came about with what's going on. I think they could have dived a little bit deeper into that, and I do think there are some characters that are just a tad underwritten, but for the most part, I enjoyed this one a lot more than I thought I was going to. I thought that the acting, like I said, was very strong. I think Mariette Lee Go did a really good job at sort of finding that nice balance between, like, you know, fun sort of teen movie, but also this darker horror movie. It leans a lot more into the darker elements than I expected. The trailer made it seem like it was going to be a little bit more comedic, and it's really not that. It's a lot more serious, but I think it works very well as such. So yeah, I enjoyed this one a lot for the most part. The other thing that works very well, this does not end abruptly. Like, it ends in a very satisfying manner. It's not like most of the Welcome to the Blumhouse films where they've ended very abruptly. This one has a legitimate ending to it. It works very well. It's a very satisfying conclusion. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. So B for Black as Night. Was honestly very surprised by how much I enjoyed this one. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same here for Bingo Hell, which is really, I think, Welcome to the Blumhouse, not at its worst, but an example of what I don't want these movies to be. Whereas Black as Night, I think, is a film that actually has very compelling characters and a good story to back it up, as well as some good horror. Bingo Hell just is it just has spectacle. Like, there really is not a lot going on in this movie in terms of a story. The characters, you really don't feel all that compelled to. I think that the story itself, it's extremely predictable where it ends up going. Like, the second you know what's going on in this film when it comes to the bingo, and the second this character, especially of this character of Mr. Big emerges on screen, like, you know exactly how he's going to be. You know the type of character he's playing. You know exactly what sort of direction they're going in with him. There's nothing surprising about this film at all, and I don't think they did a great job with it, but I also found it to be very repetitive. This film drags a lot, and I honestly felt like this would work a lot better if it was like a 40-minute episode of like an anthology series than a full-on movie, because the plot here is just very simplistic. It really is just, you have this woman, she's trying to renovate this like community of sorts, and her way to do that is like this bingo hall that all of them really cherish. She's trying to, you know, really just cultivate it in the best way possible, but there's like an underlying darkness going on. I feel like it doesn't really get that much deeper than that, and that's fine, but I just felt like there wasn't enough going on here in terms of character to really latch me onto what's happening. I actually do like the premise of this film quite a bit. I think there's a lot that you can do with it, but it just doesn't really go anywhere that particularly interesting. I think it goes in a very type of surface level direction. I will say Adriana Barraza is very good here. She definitely gives a very strong performance, especially as you get further into the film. I will say the first like 15 to 20 minutes I was really hating a lot. Like, I really just didn't want to watch this. But as we got further into it, I think her performance especially started to shine a lot more for me. But really, other than that, I didn't really get a sense of like directorial flair here. I felt Gigi Saul Guerrero's directing was just very inconsistent when it came to this film. It's very campy. And it really is just way too over the top for my liking, and I just didn't really enjoy it that much. So yeah, I mean, I didn't hate it. Like, I think there are definitely some aspects that work here, but overall was just kind of bored watching it. I will say the climax of this film honestly is pretty cool. Like, there's some really like gnarly kills in like the third act, but it does take quite a while to really get there. So C- for Bingo Hell. Wasn't really into this one very much at all. It's not the worst that like offering of Welcome. It's not the worst that like Welcome to Blumhouse is offered, but it's certainly, I would say, more on the bottom tier than some of the better ones that I'm gonna be talking about. So Lamb, I think, was a very different movie than I was really expecting, but it's still a pretty good film overall. I will say, the one thing to really know about this movie, don't go into this thinking it's a horror movie. This is very much not that, and I came out of it and I was talking to my friends about it, and they're like, oh, why is that a problem for you? I didn't say that it was like a problem. Like, I don't see it as an issue that the movie's not a horror movie. It's just, I think if you go into it thinking that it's going to be more of this like straight up horror film, you know, especially the way the trailers have marketed, I think you are going to feel like you were a bit misled, and I think that can cause you to be a little bit taken out of the film. But I think the story we have going on here, it's generally very endearing, very sweet, and a lot more of like this folk tale of sorts that I actually did enjoy quite a bit. I will say this movie did take quite a while to really get going for me. The first 20 to 30 minutes, I honestly was pretty bored. There's not a lot going on. There's honestly very little dialogue happening, and if it is, it's like very stilted sort of dialogue. But once the plot really does kick in, this really does become something really interesting, you know, where you have this family and them looking over this sort of very interesting creature that's like half lamb, half human, and them treating it like completely normal. There's something that's really sweet and like genuine about it, and I thought they did a really good job. Not to mention Ada as a character is someone you do really grow attached to. I feel like there's like a fondness to her. Like once you get past how off-putting like her look is, you really do find yourself attached to this character, and I thought they did a pretty good job with that, and you really do understand, you know, the genuine love that she feels. She doesn't really care where it comes from. She just wants that genuine love, and I think they do a strong job with that in this film, so that's something that I really did appreciate. Naomi Harris also is fantastic here. You feel the attachment that she has to Ada, but you also understand why she feels that attachment. There's a lot going on here in terms of grief, which I'm not really going to spoil, but there's a reason why the character of Maria is so attached to Ada, and you know, as you get further into the film, you really do start to understand that, and that makes her character that much more interesting as a result. And so I really like the way she portrays this character, you know, really treating Ada like this is her actual daughter and not just a lamb. You understand why this matters so much to her, and I thought they did a good job with her character overall. There's also a lot of things that happen here that sort of take you off guard. Like there's this character Peter that comes into the mix, and you think he's going to go down a certain path. They introduce this sort of element with him, which I didn't really like all that much because it felt kind of inconsequential, and I don't really know why they decided to bring it up overall. I thought, honestly, it was... I thought, honestly, it was kind of unnecessary, but then they start to go in a different direction with him, and I started to warm up to that character more. I started to like him more as a character, and I thought overall it worked a little bit better for me once I started to realize what they were really trying to get at here when it came to him, what they were really trying to do with that character, and I started to like him more. But I will say this is one of those movies where as you're watching it, you feel like something really like traumatic is about to go down because the film is very calm. Like there is this calmness to the film that honestly is kind of unsettling. And you're like, oh my God, when's the other shoe gonna drop? And it takes a long time for that to actually happen. And I was honestly kind of okay with that. Like, I enjoyed the calmness of this movie. I enjoyed getting to see these characters, you know, bonding with Ada. But eventually, it does get to a point where something really crazy does happen. The last 5 minutes of this movie are pretty insane, and I did not expect it to go in the directions that it did. I also don't really understand what they're trying to say about it. I don't really understand a lot of the deeper messages here. I feel like this is a movie that, like, you can watch several times and you can pick up different meanings from it. And I still really do enjoy the ending. Like, I think it's a pretty effective ending overall. I just don't really know what it all is supposed to mean, but I still thought it was pretty effective. But again, I still wouldn't categorize this as a horror movie. It's definitely dark. It definitely can be very foreboding, but it is much more, I would say, of just a very it's a very dark drama, I think is the best way I would categorize it. It's much more of like a folk tale and things like that. And I think it very much does work as such. There's a lot of creepy moments in here. Like I said, I think the only thing that brings this movie down for me is just for a while there isn't a lot happening in those 20 to 30 minutes. And there's a lot of things that just don't really go anywhere. And I'm kind of just like, why did they introduce this? Like, what was the point of this? One thing in particular, like I said with the Peter character, I just don't understand why it was in this film. I don't understand what they were trying to get at when it came to that character, and I think it's like, if you're going to introduce something that detrimental, you know, why don't you dive deeper into it? But they really didn't, and I just didn't really understand what they were doing there. But overall, I still really do enjoy this one. I still think this film, it's very innovative, it's incredibly creative. I really haven't seen anything quite like this before. The film's divided into 3 chapters, and each one is distinctive from the last, and that's something else that I really did appreciate. So yeah, I mean, this is still a film that I really do enjoy quite a bit. I think it's a film that definitely is not going to be for everyone. If someone told me that they straight up hated this movie, I could totally understand that. But if someone told me they absolutely love this movie and it's like one of their favorites of the year, I could totally understand that as well. I'm kind of in the middle. I don't hate it. I don't love it either, but I still do enjoy it. There's still a lot to really like about this movie, and at the end of the day, I do think that the positives very much do outweigh the negatives. The things that I really like about this movie, I really do like. The look of Ada as well, it looks so tangible. Like, even though, yeah, it's off-putting, like, this feels like if there were such a thing as, like, a hybrid lamb and human, this is very much what it would look like, and I thought they did a really great job of that. A lot of amazing shots here, cinematography-wise. Just overall, I think a very strong movie. Definitely a B- for Lamb. Like I said, takes a little while to get going, but I think if you stick with it, I think it becomes very effective viewing overall. There's Someone Inside Your House is probably one of the more frustrating films I'm going to be talking to you guys about because there's so much here that I like. There really is. I think this is a generally very creative slasher film because not only is this like just a teen slasher film, and it's actually a lot more than that. This is a teen slasher film, but it also is trying to be this like social commentary about secrets and how some of these secrets, you know, they're not going to stay secret. Eventually, they're going to have to come out one way or the other, and I think that's a really creative idea what they decide to I think that's a really creative idea, and there's a lot you can do with that. The problem is, I just don't think the execution of this movie really does this film that many favors. I think the directions this film goes in are honestly a little bit too conventional for this film, especially with how creative the killer is. I love the idea that the killer in this movie literally wears the face of the person that they're killing. Like, how cool of an idea is that? It's like you're literally getting killed by yourself. Your secrets are what's killing you. I think that's such an interesting idea. But I think the two things that really do bring out this movie is, one, like I said, it's very conventional. Two, a lot of the secrets in this film just aren't that big of a deal. Some of them very much are. Like, there are some things that are revealed in this movie, and you're like, oh my god, this really changes your perception of that character. Like, you want to know more about it. But then there's some things where it's like, that's not really that big of a deal. I don't know why this was something that they were like so like steadfast about. This can't be released. This has to be something that, you know, is kept to myself. I can't let anyone else know about it. Like, I just didn't really understand that overall. The cast here, though, is really good. Like, I think everyone acting-wise did a really solid job. Sydney Park is a very capable lead. She leads this film very nicely. You like McConaughey as a character. You want to know more about her. There's a really interesting sort of arc going on with her, and I definitely enjoyed what they did with that character overall. I think Theodore Pelledrin also is really good as the character of Ollie. He has the very interesting sort of relationship with McConaughey, and you really latch on to their relationship here. And like I said before, Aja Cooper, also in this film, very good here. I enjoyed her a lot. I think that she steals a lot of the scenes that she's in. I think she's a very solid supporting character, and I think that she is definitely really great. I think all the acting here is very strong. I think what's most disappointing is that the director of this film is Patrick Brice, and if you know Patrick Brice's filmography, I'm honestly quite let down by just how conventional this film is. This is the guy who's directed Creep and Creep 2, and he has Creep 3 on the way very soon, and I just expected a lot more from him as a director here. I just don't feel like this film had that much of a directorial flair to it, and I think the biggest issue for me is that it feels like Brice kind of has, like, he's just a little bit unsure of what he wanted this movie to be. Does he want it to be a full-on teen drama that, like, really explores these issues in, like, a nuanced and complex manner? Or does he want to be more of a teen slasher? This film is trying to be both, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just don't think these two genres blend as well as Brice really feels they are. What works so well about Creep is that it blends together this, like, black comedy and these really, like, fucked up horror elements. Like, those two things blend together really nicely. But, like, serious teen drama and horror, not really the case. I don't think it blends quite as well as Brice really thinks it does, and I think that does ultimately bring this film down quite a bit, so I think that didn't really work. And then also, when we eventually get to the killer overall, I found it to be so predictable with where they ended up going with this killer, who it turned out to be. I was not shocked in the slightest with what they ended up doing, and I was like, really? That's what you want to do? That's the direction you really want to take here? Again, I felt like there could have been a lot more creativity in this film. I felt like there were a lot more ideas that they could have explored here. And again, there's some ideas I really do like when it comes to these characters, but I just felt there was more that they ultimately could have done. I enjoyed the score here by Zachary Dawes. I do think there are some really good kills. The first kill in particular is really good. I really enjoyed the way this film started off. It's probably one of my favorite opening scenes in any horror film this year. But overall, this really is just a film that I left wanting a lot more from. I also think it's a little too short. I think if the film could have gone on for like 20 or 30 more minutes, I think it would have been that much more effective. But overall, I do still think it is worth a watch. It's certainly a lot more creative than like other horror films out there, but I also felt there was just a lot more they really could have done with it. I think this is such an interesting concept, and I think it's, for what's such a creative concept, it's executed in such a conventional manner. I think this film just deserved a lot better. So overall, I just wasn't huge on this one. So yeah, C+ for There's Someone Inside Your House. It's not bad by any means, but I just wanted a lot more from it. I'll be honest, out of the Welcome to the Blumhouse films, Madres is the one I remember the least. I really don't have a lot to say about this at all, except that I just don't think this film fully clicked for me. I think there are some really strong elements of this film. They clearly are trying to tell a story about this divide between this Mexican couple. One of them is like native speaking. He's very well trained in this environment. He knows the culture very well. And then you have one who's clearly more American, and so she doesn't know the language, she isn't as well taught, and things like that, and people kind of like discriminate against her for that reason. But it also is trying to say a lot about like childbirth and sort of like the complications and like the harsh realities of like what can really go on there, and sort of like some conspiracy theories as well. And like, again, all of those are really strong ideas. I just think overall, the way it's told, I just found to be really sluggish. I was not really into this story very much at all, especially when like the main threat of this movie is literally something as boring as like crops. That's literally the villain in this movie, are fucking plants. Like, there's not a lot to really get excited about there. It also doesn't help, and I hate to say this because I always root for new talent. I always love getting to see actors that I haven't seen before on screen. But unfortunately, the acting here I just found to be very subpar. Nobody really stuck out to me. I found everyone to be very inexperienced. And I appreciate the film really trying to like usher in new talent, but I just wasn't really impressed by anyone here. I will say the film definitely has a creepy atmosphere to it. And I did enjoy the score quite a bit. But overall, I just felt it really did fall flat to me. I think that there are some pretty effective moments in like the last act of this film, but for a while it just didn't really work for me. I think really when it comes to these Welcome to the Blumhouse films, the ones that I really don't like, I think I find the same issue with all of them, is that I think one, they are way too short. I think that's definitely a problem. But I think overall, they need to have a lot more care put into them, because as it stands right now, this is yet another one that feels like it would be a lot better if it was like a TV episode of like an anthology series, because there just isn't enough going on here story-wise to sustain the like 80-minute runtime, and it also just feels largely disposable because of how short it really is. So yeah, I mean, this one just didn't really do much for me. I thought Ryan Zaragoza's directing was pretty good, but there's some good elements, but other than that, I think this was easily the most forgettable of the bunch. So yeah, I really don't have much to say about this one at all. C for Madres. I don't think it's like absolutely terrible or anything, but it just overall didn't do much of anything for me. And the last of the Welcome to the Blumhouse films, but not the last film in this video that I'm talking about at all. There's actually quite a few more we gotta discuss, but that is The Manor, and this is one that I actually did enjoy quite a bit. I think this is a really well done film. about, this like care facility and just how terrible, the elderly can be treated and things like that. I think that's something this film definitely does do a really strong job with. And Barbara Hershey's performance here is fucking amazing. In fact, out of all the Welcome to the Blumhouse films, I think she gave the strongest performance I've seen, at least of the ones this year. I think Sydney Sweeney is still probably the strongest of the ones that I've seen, of these Welcome to the Blumhouse films. I think she still gave the strongest performance in Nocturne, but my God, Barbara Hershey is absolutely incredible here. You understand every single emotion that's going on for her. She really just wants some kind of agency. She doesn't like to be told what to do. She wants to be able to do things for herself and be independent, and everyone else is like pushing her against it, telling her that she's too old or she doesn't get to do it anymore. And you can see that this really starts to nag at her. As the film goes on, she becomes more concerned about the environment around her. And I just thought her performance was just so strong here. Every emotion just felt so raw and real. And it almost felt like this was like a very personal story to Hershey. Like, this was something that mattered a lot to her, and I think she did a really strong job with that. Nicholas Alexander's also really great here. I was honestly surprised by how much I liked him, but he's very good as her son, as like her grandson, who, he has the best intentions. Like, he thinks he's doing this to help her out, to make sure that she's feeling better, but he's also indirectly responsible for the treatment that she's receiving, which, like I said, is just way too harsh overall. And you can really just see just how hostile these people treat her. Some of the things that they do to her as a character, I was just so appalled by. I was like, why is this ever okay? But I've also heard stories that this isn't far, this really isn't far too inaccurate. Like, this is honestly pretty close to what does end up happening in these care facilities, and you really do see that here. And I think the staff are actually portrayed very well here. Some of them, it's very subtle, like they're just a little too overly friendly, like, oh, let me help you with that, or oh, I'm here to be your guide, but you can see that there's some more sinister intent, or they're just straight up hostile. Like this woman that our main character keeps coming into contact with is just so nasty to her whenever she appears. It always seems like she wants absolutely nothing to do with her. And I do think the film, like I said, does a really good job of telling the story about how elders should be treated and like just the constant abuse that they're dealing with day in and day out. I mean, it's a very important story, and one that I don't think we see enough of. I saw a film earlier this year called The Amusement Park, and I'm not going to go into that film at length. I'll discuss that more in my Catcher review because I have not had a chance to really discuss that film. But that one was really just like a PSA about elder abuse, like in public. This one deals a lot more with like what goes on behind closed doors. Like, this is stuff you don't hear about because you just assume when you put someone in a care facility that they're getting the finest care possible. And this film shows that it might not be all it's cracked up to be. And I think that's something that works very well here. And seeing these more sort of ghostly elements sort of come in, it actually works very well here, because now you have this woman that not only is looking for agency and nobody really is giving it to her, but you also have someone that's going through this situation and no one really seems to believe her. They think that she's delirious. They think that she's just kind of losing it because she's older. They kind of use that against her. So I thought that was a really strong idea. I think that's something that worked really well in this film. Unfortunately, I think what brings it down is that I just think the film's a little too short. There is a lot that this film wants to accomplish, and much of it does very well. I already touched upon the fact that like the elder abuse stuff is dead on. Like, it gets all of that done very well, and Barbara Hershey's performance is like magnificent here. But the last 15 to 20 minutes are so incredibly rushed, and the movie becomes something entirely different from what it was originally supposed to be, and I just don't think it really worked at all. Like, the idea of respecting elders, this twist comes in, really just kind of betrays the entire movie. Like, I was like, this is how we're really ending it? This is the note you really want to go out on when you had such a strong narrative? It just didn't really work for me. I get what they were trying to do, but I just don't think it went in a particularly interesting direction. I honestly felt it brought the movie down in quite a few aspects, so I wasn't a big fan of the way they wrap things up in the last 15 to 20 minutes. I also felt that almost every side character we focus on here just feels very underwritten. It really only feels like our main character is the only one we feel a fond attachment to, and her grandson. Other than that, every other character feels more like a caricature. They just don't do a ton with them. But again, the film's atmosphere and the mostly compelling story, it still is enough for me to overall recommend this one. I think there's a lot of strong elements here, and for a while, it was becoming my favorite of like the Welcome to the Blumhouse movies, but I just think that twist, it's so outlandish and just so out of nowhere. It really did bring down this movie quite a bit for me, but overall, I still would very much recommend it. I think there's a lot that really does work very well in this film. Barbara Hershey's performance alone is enough a reason to watch this one. So, B- for The Manor. I think this overall is a really compelling story, and I think there's a lot of important issues, but I just don't expect going into this to be a wholly satisfying experience, because it does kind of crash and burn at the end, but I think that the setup in the first two acts are strong enough to where I still can overall recommend this one. Oh, hey, look, it's another day, new shirt change. You guys know how it goes at this point. Like, most of the time I do these videos, I'm probably going to end up doing in multiple days. But anyway, let's move on to the next movie, Night Teeth. This is one that I was honestly really dreading, just looking at the premise and things like that. It seemed like something that was going to be like a really obnoxious movie. It honestly was a little bit better than I was expecting, but still, I wouldn't say anything that great. I will say performance-wise here, most of the performances are really good. Jorge Landenborg Jr., I've always enjoyed him. I think that he's a very capable lead. He's very, just very likable and charismatic and someone you do latch onto, and I think he does a good job. Debbie Ryan was the big one. She really surprised me in this film. I'm not usually a big fan of her, but she gives, honestly, a really subtle and kind of emotional performance, and I thought overall she did a pretty good job. You buy into her chemistry with Jorge Landenborg Jr. very well. I thought those two, sold their relationship very nicely, and I thought they did a pretty good job with that. So I think that the performances are strong. Even there are moments with these characters that aren't the worst. I think Benny as a lead character, yes, obviously he can just kind of be the everyman that's kind of pulled into this whole situation with the vampires and whatnot, but there's a little bit more going on with him. There's a really good scene where he's talking to Debbie Ryan about his passion and what he really wants to do, and it gets her to sort of open up as well. I thought that was probably the best scene in the movie for me. Everything else, at the end of really everything else I would say is just a very generic sort of vampire thriller sort of adolescent type film, young adult novel type film that you've seen 1,000 times before. There really isn't anything that different here in terms of the story. You know pretty much where it's going to go from the second that it starts. And also, the whole movie is banking on this war between vampires, and there's honestly very little action here. It's a lot of build-up, and eventually we do get, that big set piece at the end, but it all just feels like it's coming a bit too late, and I just felt like there was a little too much build-up in this movie with what they decided to really do. Also, the intrigue of our main plot, it kind of goes away very quickly because there is a point where something happens, and after that, there just isn't really that much going on when it comes to our main character and his role in all of this, and you're kind of just wondering, why is he still continuing to get himself involved when he doesn't really need to anymore? So I didn't think that was that great. And also, one of the biggest appeals, I think, going into this movie is for Megan Fox and Sydney Sweeney. I'm just going to tell you, if you're excited for them, you're going to be very disappointed because they're really not in this much at all. They're in it for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. They have a pretty good scene with Alexander Ludwig, but they really don't serve much of a purpose at all here. They're just kind of other sort of vampires, and they're sort of a part of what's going on, and there isn't a lot happening with them, so I was a little bit disappointed there. Alexander Ludwig also is not in it much. Alfie Allen I thought was honestly pretty generic a villain. There really wasn't much to him at all. The worst part of this movie for me, unfortunately, was Lucy Fry. I just was not a fan of her performance in any way. I thought she was really overdoing it as this character, especially towards the end of this movie. I really just didn't buy into anything they did with her at all, and where they went with her I found to be extremely predictable, so I just wasn't really a fan of a lot of that. I also felt the film was just kind of lacking in style. There just wasn't a lot that Adam Randall really brought to the table here. This very much felt like it could be something like Vampire Academy, Beautiful Creatures, some generic like horror teen show on Netflix. Like, there just wasn't a lot that stuck out about this movie to me. Really, I mean, the most memorable thing about this movie is that the first time I watched it, it was supposed to be like at this advanced screening, and the first like 15 minutes of the movie literally wasn't working. Everyone was going through the same problem. So the movie started like 20 minutes in. I didn't see the first 15 minutes for like forever. Thankfully, I finally was able to once the movie did come out. And then I didn't see the very ending either because it also like did the same thing. So yeah, that's literally all I'm gonna remember when it comes to this movie. There's really nothing else at the end of the day that is really going to stick with me, and if that's the most memorable thing about this, I mean, that kind of just tells you the kind of movie this is. Like, there just really isn't that much to latch onto with this one. It's not terrible or anything like that. I just think it's incredibly disposable and very generic, and you can see probably half a dozen other, like, teen-type vampire movies that are like this one. This feels very much like it's trying to be part of, like, that craze for, like, vampires and teen movies, but that's kind of like faded away. So the film overall, it just is kind of whatever. Yeah, I'd give this one a C. Like I said, wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but really nothing that great either. So you guys ready for a hot take? Yeah, The French Dispatch, Wes Anderson's new film, was very excited for it. Wasn't the biggest fan. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't in any way hate this movie. There's actually quite a few things I enjoy about this one. I think that there are definitely some very strong performances. I think that some very fun moments here. I think that, you know, a lot of people have called this like the most Wes Anderson film that Wes Anderson's ever done, and I would very much hold it to that standard. I mean, his directing is still really strong here. You can see that he really is just trying to put as much charm, but also that quirkiness that we love from him into here, and I think he does a really strong job with that. What really boils down to the fact that this movie just didn't work for me is just the screenplay here. You know, this movie is one of those films where it is an anthology of sorts, and how I always am with those films is if the stories don't hook me individually, the movie just doesn't work. And unfortunately, most of these stories just didn't really work for me. The first one with Benicio del Toro was actually very strong at first. I thought it had a lot to say about art and sort of the way that it's viewed and things like that, and you know, but also kind of telling this really sweet sort of love story. But the problem is with this first short is every single time that I'm getting into this story, you got fucking Tilda Swinton going on some like tangent. The whole story, you know, while we have this sort of, you know, interesting sort of story with Benicio del Toro, who was this guy in prison, and he was sort of like painting from there, and sort of, you know, he wanted to be very personal. He didn't want to sell out. He wanted it to be like a very intimate experience in the way, and he's sort of falling in love with Léa Seydoux, and you have Adrian Brody sort of using that to his advantage, you know, with his paintings and whatnot, trying to make him more of a household name. You got Tilda Swinton doing this like PowerPoint presentation of sorts, which feels like a TED Talk, and every time we cut back to her, it just took me out of it. I just wasn't a fan of anything that they were doing when it came to that character. The connection that she has with Benicio del Toro is very flimsy at best, and the way they try to tie it together, I just don't think fully worked for me. So again, like, this was a story I was enjoying quite a bit. I was laughing, I was charmed by what they were doing. It's just anytime we cut to her, which unfortunately is pretty frequent because she narrates this entire thing, it just really took me out of it. So I can't overall say at the end of the day that I was a big fan of this story. I think there were things that worked, but it just didn't fully come together for me in the way I wanted it to. The second one I enjoyed a lot more. It's the story where Frances McDormand and Timothy Chalamet. It goes in some really interesting directions. The relation between these two especially was not something that I was expecting going into this, and I actually really did appreciate that they went in that direction, because I think it honestly adds to the hilarity quite well. But the film also is telling this sort of cautionary tale of sorts about adolescence and politics, and I think, in a way, it has some modern sort of, it definitely has some modern influences, because you can tell it's trying to say a lot about just how passionate, younger people are about politics and how they really want to change the world and things like that. But sometimes they're a bit, over their heads, and they don't really know what they're sort of dealing with. And you have Timothy Chalamet and him trying to campaign to, really get his name out there, and he's, this writer of sorts. And I thought it was a really fun story. It went into some directions that, like I said, I wasn't expecting. The way it wrapped up, especially, I was like, oh my god, I couldn't believe they went where they did with it. But it's easily, I think, the most coherent story. It's definitely the one that I think gets, makes the most out of its runtime, because all of these stories are 40 minutes long each. And I think this is the one, to me, that felt the most complete. It felt like, okay, we have a beginning, we have a middle, we have an end here, we have a purpose for this to exist. There's nothing sort of undermining it. To me, this was easily the strongest one. I think Timothy Chalamet and Frances McDormand also easily give the best performances in this film. I think those two were incredible here. I loved their banter in the film, but I also loved where they went with these characters. It's fun, but it also goes in sort of an emotional direction, and I really did appreciate that. So yeah, I thought this story was definitely very strong. But then we get to the third one, and without getting into too much, the third story of this movie, I honestly really disliked. I found it to be incredibly boring and just didn't do much of anything for me. And I think a big reason for that is that as good as Jeffrey Wright is, which he really is selling it in this role, he is very strong here. I think my biggest issue when it came to this particular story is that it just doesn't really go anywhere interesting. It's like this whole sort of, it's like this, he's like being interviewed, and he's kind of telling this story as it's happened from the past, and it's just not told in a very interesting way. So I just wasn't a big fan of what they ended up doing with that. It's a little too quick, it's a little too silly for my liking, and I just don't think that story really went in an interesting place, and it goes on for far too long. I just never really felt connected to anything that was really going on there. It's this sort of heist mission of sorts, and I wasn't super into it. So yeah, I mean, that's what really does bring this down, is just the stories themselves are not as strong. I appreciate the fact that there was a connective tissue, there was something connecting all this together, that being Arthur Howitzer Jr. and his sudden passing, and us sort of seeing all these different writers that came together to, make this sort of collection of stories in his honor. It's really sweet the way they tie things together like that. And I think there's a really sort of touching ending that I thought worked quite well. And I think, cinematography-wise, everything is amazing here. I mean, it's so immaculately conceived. When it's Wes Anderson, he had such a specific style, and that's really no different here. Even the third story, which I didn't like that much, there's this really cool sort of animation thing that they do, and I kind of wish the entire story was done in this animated style, because suddenly everything was just a lot more interesting and everything popped more, and I was suddenly a lot more into it. So I kind of wish they would have just gone along with that. But I mean, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting directorial choices here. The music's really great. There's a lot of things to like about this movie. It's just at the end of the day, I just don't really see it sticking with me. I think that it's honestly quite forgettable. There wasn't a lot that I got out of it. I think the film has some interesting things to say about artists in different ways. Each short kind of has its own sort of meaning, but they're all about art in some way, and I think that does work pretty well. But at the end of the day, I just wasn't a huge fan of this film. I really wanted to love it, and I was actually liking it for a while, but once we got to that third story, it really just brought things down for me, and it really just showed me why this movie just wasn't quite coming together in the way that I wanted it to. So unfortunately, I do have to give The French Dispatch a C+. I really admire the ambition and just the talent that Wes Anderson has. That is definitely still very much on full display, but in terms of story, I think he just really missed the mark here. I think there was an opportunity to dive a lot deeper into what was going on. There's also a lot of actors here that are completely underutilized. Like, there's a lot of actors I was looking forward to seeing in this, and they have like nothing to do, and I think they could have done a lot more with some of them, so that was a little bit disappointing to me as well. Again, not terrible. A lot of people are liking this one, and I'm sorry that it's great that people are enjoying it. I even enjoyed quite a bit of it. I think I honestly would watch it again. Like, I wouldn't be opposed to watching this movie again, but just overall, I left the film just a little bit let down, so I wanted a lot more from it, I think. I think there was more that they could have very much accomplished with this one. And I want to reiterate, like, I had some fun with this movie. I was laughing quite a bit. I think there were some very memorable scenes. I just think as a whole, it just isn't a totally memorable experience. I think there's a lot of things here that do hold it back for me. I think that there's more that I could have done in quite a few aspects, and I just wanted more from this film, I think. Now, we go from a film that honestly kind of disappointed me to a film that really surprised me in a big way. In fact, it's easily one of the most surprising movies of the year, in Ron's Gone Wrong. I honestly really like this film a lot. I went into it very skeptical, kind of feeling like it was just going to be like a very like middle of the road kids film. This has not been a very strong year for animated movies, but this is honestly a very well done animated film, I think. I think what this film does a really good job with is telling the story that, yes, we have seen before. We've seen the story of the boy that's an outcast, and he makes friends with, you know, this sort of artificial intelligence, and they sort of bond, but there's a little bit more going on here than that. It's not that straightforward. I think this film presents it in a very endearing manner. I think the story that we're told here, you know, it's done very well. And Ron as a character, I mean, Zach Galifianakis is easily one of the most, I think, just likable sidekicks in an animated film that I've seen in such a long time. He is perfectly cast here. Ron just has like this quintessential like innocence about him that you just can't help but latch onto. Like, even when he's, you know, I was very worried this character was gonna be very annoying, very grating, but you just can't help but just love everything about him. He just, like I said, he has this innocence. He has this heart to him. You can see everything he does is so well intentioned, and I really loved what they did with his character. He was so much fun to watch here. And Jack Dylan Grazer is also really great as Barney. I'm always a big fan of him. I think, you know, the more he goes on, the better he really does become. I think their dynamic is really strong for sure. You really do find yourself latching onto that relationship. But I also really like what this film has to say about the internet, because I'm not going to lie to you guys. For the first, I would say, 30 to 40 minutes of this movie, I did have a pretty big issue with this film in that I was attached to Barney because of the fact that, you know, you understand that he's an outcast and that he's kind of having a hard time making friends, and he's kind of in a place where, like, he wants to make friends, but he's just kind of struggling with doing so, and he thinks that the only way to, you know, get him to be popular is to get one of these, is to get one of these B-bots. He's doing it to become more liked. He's not really doing it for his own reasoning. He's really doing it because he wants to make friends, and I think that's something that you really do latch onto. The issue I was having is that I felt virtually every other character just felt kind of one note to me, especially when it came to this character of Savannah. Savannah is someone we meet very early on in the film. She is this vlogger. She's constantly obsessed with filming everything. She's a full-on TikToker. I mean, that's her entire life pretty much. She goes around school. Everyone loves her. She's so popular. She's basically this huge internet star. But as the film goes on, we start to realize that she's not not necessarily happy within this life. Aside from that bubble, once she leaves it, she doesn't really know what her life is. She doesn't really know what to do with herself. And the same goes for the character of Rich. And when we started to dive a lot deeper into them, I started to like the film even more because I started to realize what it's really trying to say. This film is saying some very interesting things about the internet, and that, you know, we constantly consume ourselves with the internet. We are constantly just attaching to ourselves to all these different social media platforms and posting about our life constantly. But when that goes away, you know, do we have a life behind it? Is that something that is important to us? Can we move on without it? And I think this film does a really good job of diving headfirst into those issues, and that's something that I really did end up appreciating overall. So I thought that was definitely really great, and I end up liking those characters a lot more as a result. The animation here is also absolutely spectacular. It's so creative to watch, and the B-bots themselves are so much fun. Each one of them has their own, like, sort of specific thing that they do, but that's also why you latch onto Ron, because he's so different from all of the other ones. Like, he isn't there to just be like this, this sort of emotionless robot that's just gonna tend to their needs and help them gain better social standing. Like, he has a personality. There's someone behind all of that, and I think that's what really attaches you to Ron as a character. I was also surprised by just how much this movie was making me laugh. I thought there were so many hysterical moments here. One in particular involving this joke, and I could not believe they got away with it. I was like, oh my god, did they actually say that? And they did, and it just, stuff like that just really worked for me. It's involving a scene where Barney's at school and there's something that goes down. You'll know it when you see it, but it was absolutely hysterical. I love the way that was done. So yeah, there's really a lot that I do love about this movie. I think the ending is honestly quite touching, the way things do wrap up. It ends in a slightly predictable manner, but it ends in a way that I think was just right. And I think, like I said, with the film essay about internet and things like that, all of that is very strong, and just the effect that it has on kids to the point where they constantly consume themselves with the internet. They don't really have a life like outside of it. I think that's a really interesting sort of thing that this film tackles. It's not perfect though. There are a couple things I think that do bring it down, and I talked about before, I thought some of the characters were a bit flat. The one character that really did not have that much to do for me was Barney's father, Graham. You understand who he is, you understand the devotion and the love he has for his son, but like aside from that, we really don't know a lot about him. We know they're not necessarily, he's not necessarily the most like financially stable, but there just isn't really a lot for him to do. Olivia Colman is also really great here. She's really fun in this movie, but she really doesn't have a ton to do after a while. Like, I felt like she really got pushed to, she kind of gets sidelined after a while, and I wanted to see more from her. There's a really fun moment with her in the third act, but they just didn't really do a ton there. And also, these sort of creators we follow with the Bubble company that, produce these B-bots, I just wasn't super into their characters. It felt very similar to a storyline we just saw in Free Guy, and I think Free Guy handled it much better than they did here. Here, it really just kind of felt like an afterthought. It's something they did to try to give these characters a little bit more than they had on the surface, and I just don't think it fully came together in the way that they wanted it to. Also, as I said, I do think there are some parts where this movie did drag a bit. There's a part in the second act that I thought just dragged a little bit for me, and it does take a little while for this movie to end, but overall, I was surprised by how much I really did enjoy this one. It's charming, it's fun, it's got a really great message behind it, some really strong performances, especially from Zach Galifianakis, who, my god, just keep doing animated stuff. Like, this is his wheelhouse. This is exactly where I think he excels the most. I've said it since, like, Lego Batman movie. He is just amazing when he plays animated characters, and this is without a doubt, I think, one of his best performances yet. Just in general, I enjoyed this movie a lot, way more than I thought I was going to. I really would recommend this one. I know it's going to be on HBO Max and Disney Plus very soon, and I definitely do recommend checking it out. I feel like this one was kind of forgotten by people. I was literally the only person in my theater when I saw this movie. and there was a point where the screen literally froze and they did nothing for a while, so I ended up leaving the film and watching the rest online in like shitty quality because I had to, so I could review the movie to you guys. But yeah, I enjoy it a lot more. I think it's generally very charming, it's very fun, and I'd recommend it. So I am going to give this one a B. I really wish more people saw it because it's a much better film than I think it had really any right to be. So, Hypnotic, I'll be honest, I don't remember this movie very much. Look, this was a film that I was simultaneously dreading, but also excited for. The reason I was excited for it was because of Kate Siegel, and she does deliver. She does give a strong performance here. She continues to show that she is a very strong actress. She's really good in these kind of roles, you know, playing this character, Jen, that you can tell is just kind of unsatisfied in her life. She wants to find a way to become more fulfilled, to turn her life around, to just be in a better place mentally, and I think she does play that role quite well. But the thing that was constantly holding me back from being like really excited from this were the directors attached. Matt Engel and Suzanne Kutz wrote a little movie called The Open House, and you guys know how much I really detested that film. A lot of people think it's like one of the worst on Netflix. I wouldn't go that far because I've seen a lot of films from Netflix, and that's definitely a bad one, but it's not one of their worst. It's just a really unsatisfying film. This is a definite improvement. I will definitely say that. I do think this is a definite improvement for sure. This film is far more coherent. This film ends in a satisfying manner. It doesn't feel like they were just writing it as they went along, so I definitely will give them that. But in terms of making like a generally good movie, I wouldn't really say that. This film just isn't very memorable. From the second it starts, I feel like you know where it's going to go, and it goes in like a very obvious direction. And just, you know, the first like 20 to 30 minutes I was actually really liking, but after a while, it just really lost me. I just wasn't super invested in what was going on. I wasn't super engaged with anything here. It just wasn't really that memorable of a film. I think there are some good moments, but as a whole, it just didn't really come together for me. The dialogue also is really not the best here. It does feel very first draft, so a better film from Matt Engel and Suzanne Kutz, but a generally good movie. It's just not really there yet. I think that they had a better idea of what they wanted to do this time around, but the film is just way too generic and emotionally hollow for me to overall recommend it, or really to leave any impact on me whatsoever. So C- for Hypnotic. I really don't have much to say about this at all. Oh my god, Antlers. Probably one of the most frustrating and disappointing experiences that I have seen in any film this year. I was really pulling for this one. This is a film that, you know, there were so many like ads and things for it, and it was constantly getting pushed back, and because of that, you know, the more it got pushed back, the more excited I really did become, because I thought this could be like a really innovative and like thought-provoking sort of, you know, supernatural horror film. And honestly, what I got instead was a very one note and just very surface level exploration of abuse and PTSD and things like that. And there are things that this film does dive into, but it does it in such a surface level manner. Like Carrie Russell's character, for example, the reason that she is so attached to everything that's going on is because of like, you know, parental abuse that she went through in her childhood, and that's what sort of connects her to everything, but it's done in like such a surface level manner. We never really get a full exploration of it. There's really only one scene where she finally like lets loose about everything, and so because of that, she just doesn't have like a ton to work with here. I do think she gives a really strong performance in this film, but just as a whole, I wanted more with this character. I wanted to see more of a connection with her. I wanted to see her go through this journey of sorts, and I just didn't really feel like she did in this film, and that definitely did disappoint me overall. But also just the main story that's going on here, it just isn't super interesting. It sounds honestly a lot more interesting than it really is, where, you know, Carrie Russell is the school teacher, and she discovers that one of her students is like harboring some like creature in their house, and, you know, we know from the very beginning what is going on here, so there really isn't much of a mystery at all, so that already kind of wrecks it. But what really does bring it down is that it just takes a long time for anything to really happen in this movie. And so because of that, I just found myself not really invested in this film very much at all. It's very sluggish in terms of its pacing. It's honestly kind of listless in terms of its storytelling as well. I just wasn't super invested in this film at the end of the day. And it sucks because I do think there are some really good things to talk about when it comes to this film. I mean, the creature design is top notch. I loved the creature design of this movie. The look and feel of everything. It's so like gross and like just kind of like it's so like gross and gory, but it really does go for it. And there are some really nice kills in this movie that I really did appreciate. And I think that's something that does stick out about this film, is that there are some really strong kills. But as a whole, I just don't think the film fully came together for me. I think that there are a lot of ideas here that just weren't fully explored. Like I said, I think this movie is trying to say a lot about parental abuse and sort of like the effect that has on children, sort of the domino effect that it has on them. But I just don't think it went to the depths that it really needed to. And what sucks is that I think Jeremy T. Thomas is giving a legitimately really strong performance here. He doesn't have like a ton of dialogue, but you can tell in every single expression, you know, how he really is feeling in this given moment, the impact that this is having on him. You know, you really do feel that in this movie, and I think that's something they do a pretty strong job with. I just think as a whole, it just didn't fully come together for me, and I just was, again, very let down by that. But the other thing that really surprised me is that we get a surprisingly very hollow and honestly wooden performance here from Jesse Plemons, who I don't know if it was just a bad day on set or if he just wasn't in the right headspace, but he just seems so checked out of this movie. Every scene with him in this film, I felt like he was going through the motions. I felt like he was really just kind of reading lines off a script. This is probably one of the weakest performances I've ever seen from him. I didn't feel that he brought anything unique to this role, and it's so disappointing because Jesse Plemons, I think, is one of the best character actors working today. He usually really excels when he plays a character, but I think it's also because this is very much like a straight man kind of role. Like Julie to elevate the material. So yeah, I mean, this film just really let me down overall. I also think it's way too short, even though, like I said, the film was pretty boring overall. I think the film needed to be a lot longer to really get to the places that we wanted it to, because once we get to the third act, it just feels like we are getting to things way too quickly. This is being resolved way too quickly, and I think they could have done a much better job with that. So yeah, like I said, I don't totally hate this movie. I just really wanted a lot more from it. I think there's some good themes here, but all of them are done in such a one-note type manner. Our characters here are very thinly sketched. There are some strong performances from Kerry Russell and Jeremy T. Thomas, and I think Scott Hayes does a pretty good job here too, but the directing here from Scott Cooper I thought was very much lacking. I just didn't feel much of a directorial flair from him. I thought that there was some really cool creature designs, one really good kill especially that I found to be very memorable, but just as a whole, I just think this film could have been so much more. It really just feels like this was a film that they had an idea, but they just didn't fully know how to execute it, and as a result, what we got instead was, I think, it's just a surprisingly very dull film that I think could have been a lot better overall. So C- for Antlers, easily one of the most disappointing movies I think I've seen all year. And yeah, like, there are cool themes here, there are some interesting ideas, but because of the fact that we don't really dive into them, this is just a very generic horror film at the end of the day. Day, and I really just wanted a lot more from that. I know that Scott Cooper especially is capable of doing more. Guillermo del Toro, who produces this movie, is capable of doing a lot more. So I really just expected this film to be much better than it really did turn out to be. But alas, the film that we have here just was a real crushing disappointment overall. Army of Thieves seems to be a film that just a lot of people just kind of ignored, or they just didn't really know was out, and I don't really blame them. I don't think this film had the best marketing at all, but after having seen it, I can understand why people aren't talking much about it, because it really isn't anything that great. It's not bad or anything. In fact, I do think there are some parts of this that are very enjoyable. I just think as a whole, compared to Army of the Dead, I mean, this film really does leave a lot to be desired. First of all, I mean, character-wise here, the film is very much lacking. I think that Dieter as a character especially, you know, he was really fun in that first movie. You enjoyed him being the safecracker, but he was also like a very simplistic character. You didn't know a ton about him. You knew that he was good at cracking safes. You knew that he was also kind of just terrified at what was going on with the zombies and things like that. And, you know, he was always like very like hyperventilating a lot, and he was always very overly stressed. But that was enough. Like, you didn't need to do much more with that character. And in here, they try to dive a bit deeper into him, and he just isn't a very interesting character to watch. I feel like this is the perfect example of taking a side character and forgetting why they worked as a side character, and, you know, not being able to recognize that sometimes a side character only works as just that. And that's really the issue here, is that Dieter just doesn't really work, I think, as a main character in this movie. I just wasn't really that attached to him, nor was I attached to the character of Gwendolyn either. I found her to be very one note. I didn't think I thought, you know, again, what elevates this film are the performances. All of them are really good. You can tell everyone is having a lot of fun in this movie, and they're trying to bring something to it, but I just found these characters to just not be all that interesting. I will say Matthias Schweiger's directing is pretty good here. He definitely does have a directorial flair. He definitely has a style. This is much more of a comedy. This is much more of this sort of heist film, and I think it does work as that, and I think he does direct it pretty well. And there were some moments that I did find to be a lot of fun. I just think as a whole, there just wasn't really a lot to this film, and for a movie that's over 2 hours, I mean, there should be a lot more going on here. This really is just a very simplistic heist film where you get to see, you know, why he became so good at safecracking, but you also have this romance going on, which also feels incredibly forced. It really just feels like the romance is here as an excuse for this movie's existence. That's the only reason the romance is here in this film, so there's like a reason to watch this movie, because really, I mean, this entire film to me, it kind of feels like, you know, a movie that you would get as like a bonus feature during Army of the Dead. There just really isn't a lot to this overall. It feels very generic. It feels very disposable, and there just isn't really a lot to say. I think that the actual heist scene is a lot of fun. There are definitely some scenes in this film that did make me laugh. I think the connections to Army of the Dead are honestly pretty good. There are some good tie-ins here, but just as a whole, I don't really see a reason for this to exist other than to really show, I think, Schweiger's directorial flair, and to show that he does definitely have it in him to direct a movie. I just wish that the movie that he directed was far more interesting than this one, because as a whole, I just didn't really get much of anything from this movie. I wanted a lot more from it, but honestly, you know, the more I think about it, the less I really do remember anything about it. So yeah, C for Army of Thieves. I think this film could have been really good, but just as a whole, I don't think they had a lot to really deliver here, and so I think it's probably one of the more unnecessary sequels that I've seen in quite a bit. I don't really see a reason for this movie to exist. I don't really know why this needs to be a thing. I know Netflix is trying to make Army of the Dead their like next big thing, and I'm here for that. But if this is any indication as to what we're gonna get, I do not think that is a smart idea, because this was very disposable content that is, honestly, I'm fine with people I'm fine that not many people are talking about. Like, it's easy to see why not many people are talking about this one, because it really isn't anything that great at the end of the day. And the last movie we're going to be talking about here is Paranormal Activity Next of Kin. I can't believe that Paranormal Activity is still going. I'll just say that right off the bat. I can't believe that these movies are very much still a thing, but they are, and we have this new one, and I will say it's definitely better than some of the sequels. My opinions on the Paranormal Activity series, that I think the first three are really good. The third one easily being the best for me. That's the one that I remember the most. That one had some legitimately very creepy moments, but I think also it had a pretty solid story to it. I think once we got past the third one, the franchise really kind of just lost its way and just really, at that point, overstayed its welcome. And so I do like the idea that we have a film like Next of Kin to sort of reinvigorate the Paranormal Activity franchise as a whole, to really sort of regain its purpose. And this film does make a considerate effort to try to do that. This film is very different from the other ones we've gotten. For one thing, it's not really filmed like a found footage movie. This is much more of like a straightforward film, and it's an interesting approach. I will definitely say that. I like the fact that they're trying to do something different here. But the problem is, in doing that, I think it sort of lessens the reasoning to make this a Paranormal Activity film. It doesn't really justify its existence in that way, especially when very little of this movie has anything to do with paranormal spirits whatsoever. We're much more dealing with, like, witchy and, like, coven sort of aspects here. This feels much more like a Blair Witch movie than, like, a Paranormal Activity film. And I think the setup here is solid enough, where you have this girl and she's trying to, reconnect to her mother. She wants to know more about like her lineage and things like that. And she wants to get more into that extended family because she really hasn't known much about them at all. And so she's kind of she's making this documentary as like a way to like get in touch with them and like show off her experience. I think that's a solid enough setup. But the problem is, I just think as a film, it doesn't really go much of anywhere that interesting, and I think that definitely does bring the film down, is that the screenplay here just isn't really that great, and I think overall it just doesn't really justify its existence all that much. But I also think that the, idea of making this more of this sort of like coven film, again, it just doesn't really work as a Paranormal Activity movie. It really brings down, what we've come to know from this franchise. And I think especially if you were a fan of this franchise, I think this film, it just really feels out of place. And I think that's the big issue with this at the end of the day, is that you look at the other Paranormal Activity films, and if you're counting this in the same franchise, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. You're like, oh, this is still a Paranormal Activity film? It just didn't really make sense to me. The film also does not do a good job of making it still seem like it's in its own reality. Like the other films, I think, did a good job of making it seem like this could be a real thing. Obviously, it's not a real thing, but they at least made an attempt. This one doesn't really do that. In fact, I kept forgetting that they were even filming a documentary, because there's so many points in this film where it's shot and you can tell this cannot possibly be shot by the person that's supposed to be filming the documentary. This is very much something that the cinematographer of this movie did on their own, and they decided to shoot it this way, and it just doesn't really work. It really kind of takes you out of the movie, so I don't think that really worked overall. Especially in the third act of this movie. I mean, they don't even try to make this seem like a found footage movie anymore. It feels very much just like a studio film, and it's like, it's good to watch because they're actually showing you stuff. They're not just like cutting away. But with this supposed to be a found footage movie, or at least I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be a found footage movie, they certainly act like it is, it just doesn't fully commit to it. And if you're not going to commit to it, why even try? It really just baffles me, a lot of the choices in this movie. Like I said, I think the story here, it's not the worst. Like, there were definitely some interesting aspects to it, but I think it just doesn't really go much of anywhere interesting, and that's something that definitely did bother me. I will say the acting here really wasn't that bad. Emily Bader, I thought, honestly gave a pretty strong performance. You understood Margot's connection, everything. You understood why this mattered so much to her, and I think they did a pretty strong job with that. And there were some legitimately creepy moments in this film, and and that's something I did overall appreciate. And the other thing I will give this film is that unlike the other Paranormal Activity movies where right when they get interesting, the film just kind of like cuts off and it just ends, this film actually lets you see all of the carnage, all of the, freaky shit that goes down. It doesn't just cut off. It actually does give you somewhat of a legitimate finale, and that's something I did appreciate in this film. But even in doing so, it still does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, and that's something that didn't really work for me. Like I said, there are things that they've done better here. Like, the film does have a solid build-up, I will say that. It's not just like it gets interesting during the last 5 minutes and the rest of it is pointless. Like, there is a solid enough build-up here. There is intrigue, there's a mystery, albeit it's very sort of just generic and it's very easy to see where it's gonna go, but there at least is some sort of a mystery. But again, I think really the biggest issue with this film is that at the end of the day, it just doesn't feel like a Paranormal Activity movie, and I really think this would have been much better if this was just its own thing. If there was a movie that was just called Next of Kin and it was a found footage movie and this is what we saw, like, I would be fine with that. The problem is, as a Paranormal Activity film, it just feels very odd in this franchise. It does not fit here at all, and I think that's what really brings it down here. I really am honestly struggling to even compare it to the others, and I think that's the other thing that's going to be a challenge for people when watching this movie. It's like, how can you even compare it to the other films? Because there's very little this has in comparison to them. There's very little this has, like, in terms of, like, similarities. It's just a very different kind of movie overall. So yeah, I mean, it's not really all that bad. It's certainly better than, like, some of the recent sequels we've gotten, but I don't really think it's anything that great either to fully recommend. I didn't hate myself when watching it. I think there are honestly some pretty good aspects of it, and there are some things they did improve, but it's just such a puzzling entry. And it's not to say, like, I don't like, witchy type movies, but the problem is, in what's supposed to be a Paranormal Activity movie, this film just feels very out of place, and it doesn't really feel like it fits in the, in this franchise overall. So I think that's what really does kind of hold it back for me, and I think that's what makes it very hard to review as a film. It's like, do I review this as its own thing, or do I review it as a Paranormal Activity movie? Because it really is trying to be both, and I think it needed to just be its own thing, and I think it would have been much better as a result, and I think that's what really does bring it down overall. Like, I get what this film's purpose is, but I just think as a whole, it's just very flawed because, again, when there's no mention of the other Paranormal Activity films, there's little mention of anything paranormal at all. It just really is very hard to even talk about because it doesn't have much in common with the predecessors. So I think I have to go ahead and give this one a C-. It's not terrible or anything, but it's definitely one of the more puzzling entries I think we've gotten in what's already a very up and down franchise overall. And oh my god, we made it to the end of yet another What I Watched video. I know that there was a lot to talk about here. I know I talked about some of these movies for a long time, but hey, I had a lot to say about some of them. So, you know what? That's just how it is. But anyways, guys, that's it for this video. Like I said, I am going to try my hardest to catch up in these past few days. I hope that I'm able to do that, but we will see how that all does go down. That's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, comment down below and let me know what you guys thought of any of these movies that I discussed. Love to hear your thoughts on all of that. We'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.